Today's book is The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. You've probably heard about it already. It's quite famous. It's got a TV show. So this book has been kind of vaguely on my list of books to read ever since college, where it was recommended to me by a couple different people, if memory serves, in college. Both of them women, both of them kind of feminists, both of them political, who felt that this book did a very good job of speaking to their cause. I mentioned that because, well, I don't know. I'll get into this a bit later, but the advertising line for this book was always that it had a powerful political message. I put it off for years, partly because I got the impression that, it was one of those books you should read rather than a book that was fun to read. But over the years, a few things have kind of popped it up into my consciousness. I read an excerpt by Margaret Atwood of The Blind Assassin years ago, and I thought, oh, this is actually quite well written. I'd be interested to read her other stuff. And then, of course, the TV show, the Hulu original. I've not seen it, any of it, not even like one episode or anything. But just kind of the knowledge that this is a kind of a TV show out there makes me curious again to check out the book, because then you're thinking, all right, maybe this isn't just political. Maybe there's an interesting story here, an immersive world, a setting and stuff like that. Not just for a movie, but for a whole TV show. I don't even know much about the TV show. Several seasons, one season, multiple episodes at least, so right? And then I picked this copy off of my mom. She had brought it when she was last visiting me in Vietnam. It's got the Hulu original picture here, the picture from the TV show. But the text is the same as the text that was published in 1986. Okay, now the book itself. I am probably going to make a lot of people mad, but I didn't get it. I'm not quite sure what she's critiquing. I got done with the book. I was kind of confused as I was reading it, kind of like, all right, what's going on here? What's the object of the critique? And then I got to the end of it, and I still didn't know. So then I went to YouTube to watch a bunch of book reviews of people talking about this book. There are a lot of people talking about this book, almost all of them women. Again, I don't know if that's significant. I did find one man. Well, two if you count John Green. He did an episode for Crash Course Literature, but he's kind of doing this as a professional, just in terms of your hobbyist book reviewers. I only found one guy reviewing it. And they all said, oh, this is such an amazing book. You can really feel a number of them said, it's scary because you can imagine this actually happening. And I was like, did we read the same book? I don't know. I didn't feel like I got anybody on YouTube that I watched, and I only watched about 10 of them, so I don't know. Maybe I didn't dive deep enough. I didn't feel like anyone was kind of coming on my same wavelengths, saying that there were things about this book that worked and things about this book that didn't. And I'm somewhat hesitant here because the book is a classic, and maybe I just don't get it. Maybe there's something I'm not cluing into. So if that's the case, feel free. Let me know how I got it wrong. But let me just try and explain how I see this book and what I see as kind of working here and what I see as not working. Now, advance warning. This is going to go on for a bit. I anticipate the camera I'm using has a 30-minute time limit. After 30 minutes, it just automatically shuts itself off. I'm anticipating that's going to happen to me. Also, I'm probably going to talk incoherently and talk in circles and stuff like that, because tend to ramble when I do these unscripted videos, so you're forewarned. That being said, I'm going to try and get into it. Right. So the book is often compared to 1984, like right here on the back cover. Just as the world of Orwell's 1984 gripped our imagination, so will the world of Atwill's Handmaid. Now, 1984 is one of my favorite books of all time, so that's like definitely a mark in favor of this book. But on the other hand, it's kind of a mark against it at the same time, because we already have 1984, right? So you're going, all right, book, what have you got that's going to be better than 1984, that's going to justify your existing? It's a lot of the same kind of government things as 1984, you know, spies everywhere, people trying to control you down to even your personal life and kind of control what you read and what you consume, and all this type of stuff. So you can't even, you have to be very careful even in your private conversations. That's all very reminiscent of 1984. Now, I mentioned John Green's video earlier. John Green actually picked up on something that I didn't, which is some of the important differences between this and 1984. 1984 was advancing the thesis that the state could just kind of control your personal mind, like they could burrow in there and completely transform you, like they did to Winston at the end of it. Here it's a major theme of the book that that's the one thing they can't do. And so she still feels human emotion all throughout the book. She still feels empathy and even sympathy for the kind of people who are enslaving her. So I didn't catch that, but kudos for John Green for catching that. That John Green argues that that's a rebuttal kind of against Orwell's view. So yeah, all right, that's something different. The big thing in here is, yeah, something about sex and patriarchy and oppression. Okay, so yeah, there's obviously a fear in here that women are going to lose the ability to control their own sexuality. And you can see where this is coming from. Now, this book was written in 1986, kind of when the backlash against the sexual revolution was in full swing with kind of the religious right. These kind of culture wars have kind of continued unabated ever since then, I think. Although, I don't know, like maybe the height of the pro-life movement was kind of in the 80s. That's in when this big kind of backlash came in. Backlash against the sexual revolution and the pro-choice abortion legalization. And it's mixed in. There are allusions to pornography here and the cultural wars over the pornography. And I think the common thread that both of them have is that they're political issues to do with women's sexuality, in which there's a sense that women are kind of losing control over these issues, that kind of the political forces, mainly the men, are kind of coming in and legislating stuff. And yeah, there's mixed in with that. I guess today we would call it slut shaming, although it wasn't a term in the novel. But one of the characters got gang raped at one point, and she was made to feel like it was all her own fault. So this idea of kind of women losing complete control over their sexuality and kind of getting blamed for anything about their sexuality. Now, this is legitimate as far as it goes, right? Nobody could say this doesn't happen, or has been happening. Arguably, you don't even need to do a dystopian novel about this. You could just go back 200 years and you could write about it, you know, in the past. Or you could, you know, go to a different part of the globe, like, for example, the Taliban nowadays, or some other equally oppressive regime where they've really kind of cracked down on women's sexual freedom. And you could find somewhat similar things happening nowadays. Not in America, but in places. Which almost begs the question, why do it as a dystopian novel, right? Why not... Yeah. Why not either talking about it in the here and now, because these are issues in the here and now, or talk about it as a problem that was in the past? I guess the argument for doing it as a dystopian novel is if you talk about the past, or if you talk about a distant corner of the world, people are going to say, that doesn't apply to me. Maybe a comparison you could make is the famous anti-Nazi novel, It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. If you're not familiar with that book, it was a book that was published in the 1930s, warning of fascism coming to America. Now, you could say, well, he doesn't need to publish a dystopian novel about fascism coming to America. Fascism was already in Germany. He could have just written about that. But that's not the point. The point is, it could happen here. It could come into America. So I think that's why she was doing this, kind of setting it in the future. Now, speaking of It Can't Happen Here, I did review that book on my blog, kind of in my archives, and I made the comment that I didn't think it was realistic. Not that fascism couldn't come to America. It could, but it wasn't going to come to America overnight. It would be kind of a long and gradual process before it gained control. And it would especially be a long and gradual process before it was normalized, where people were kind of accepting that this is just the way it is. And It Can't Happen Here, the transition happens much too rapidly, and it becomes normalized much too rapidly. I have the exact same criticisms of this book. In this book, the United States government falls apart, and this kind of fascistic, kind of big brother, Stalinist, I don't know what you call it, kind of a totalitarian government takes over. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but it happens in a very condensed time frame in this book. I'm not sure they ever mention the exact time frame, but I think the main character is 33 at the time, and she has flashbacks to herself in her 20s. So it happened in a period of kind of 5 to 10 years. The American government collapsed. This new kind of totalitarian regime took hold, and everything's so normalized now. Like, they have their own traditions and everything, and I know that the time frame isn't the point. I shouldn't quibble with the time frame. The time frame is just there for dramatic purposes. But yeah, I thought, no, this, I don't know, maybe the United States government could collapse relatively quickly. But like, people wouldn't become normalized to this new totalitarian government. Now then, here's a bizarre thing here. In this new totalitarian government, it's a patriarchy kind of based on the Bible. And also, there's some sort of plague that goes through and makes a bunch of women infertile, or humans infertile. It's not really explained in depth, but something happened. And there's also some toxic environmental disaster. Again, it's not really explained in depth, but something has happened. And this is in addition to the kind of terrorist attack which destroyed the United States government. There's kind of a trifecta of things going on here. So because of the infertility crisis, what they do is they round up the fertile women who become handmaids. And this is where the handmaids thing comes from. What they do is, it's a right-wing Christian regime. So they decide they don't recognize second marriages because, you know, no divorce in the Bible. And they don't recognize kind of people who were having adulterous or unmarried relationships and sex. So they take these women who had been compromised in their view, who are no longer pure, force them to be handmaids, and they will go from house to house, they get stationed in various houses where they're supposed to bear the children in cases where the wives are infertile and can't conceive. So the husband will have sex with them instead. Now at this point I'm like, okay, where is this coming from? I mean, what is this a critique of? if the religious right ever gets into power, they're going to do this. I mean, they're not. And even within the novel, even within the novel, you need all these external events to cause this, right? You need the infertility crisis to happen. And I don't know, I guess the environmental disaster is almost kind of secondary in the novel. But yeah, so like, okay, let me back up a bit here. Why do you write a dystopian novel? So Orwell's 1984. Orwell was writing that dystopian novel as a warning. He said, be careful, because if you're not careful, this is the kind of society that we could have in the future. Do you want that? Right? That was the whole purpose of the novel. Now, does every dystopian novel have to be like that? Well, I guess you could have like the fun dystopian novels, right? Like the science fiction ones where you have a dystopian novel just as an excuse for an adventure setting where the brave hero has to fight against them. Okay, so you could have like the action adventure ones or whatever. But if you have one of those, this is not this novel. This novel spends a lot of time kind of talking about the emotional and psychological effects of this new regime and kind of how terrible it is for everyone. And there's a lot of description, and it's really depressing, and it's not a fun action adventure dystopian novel. This is one of those dystopian novels where you really have to think. Is this the society you want? Because if you're not careful, we could end up with this society. And I'm thinking, okay, so the United States government collapses and there's an infertility crisis and some sort of environmental crisis. I guess if all of those things happened at once, we could end up with this novel. What is the point of this? What are we doing here? I didn't get what it was critiquing. So then I thought to myself, I said, okay, maybe the point of a dystopian novel isn't to warn against a possible present. Because, you know, if you think about it, there are like hundreds of ideologies out there in the world. And not all of them are going to come into power. Some of them are on the fringe. Some of them will always be on the fringe. Through fiction, you don't need to worry how likely is it this group will come into power. You could just explore what if they came into power and use that as a way of critiquing that ideology or kind of exploring it. So take something that doesn't have a realistic chance of coming into power, but use fiction to kind of explore what would happen. And I thought, okay, arguably they're doing it here. Now, who are they critiquing? I think they're critiquing religion, the religious right, and this kind of very controlling view of sexuality, except Margaret Atwood, in the author's introduction here, kind of says quite clearly in a number of interviews as well, I think, she says, I'm not critiquing religion. In her view, this group is only using a religion as a cloak. So the idea is kind of any group that came to power in America would use religion to kind of cloak its ideology in, because this is America. She says it wouldn't be communism or Islam, right? If it happened in the Islamic world, it would be Islam. If it happened, in a communist country, they'd use communism to kind of cloak whatever they're doing. But in America, you'd use Christianity. And okay, fair enough. That does make sense. I mean, like Donald Trump is a perfect example, right? Just about the most un-Christian man you could imagine, lived a completely un-Christian life, sleeping with Playboy models and paying them off and all that kind of stuff. Gets into power in part by courting the evangelicals and kind of cloaking himself in this Christian rhetoric. Okay, so if they're not, and there are, yeah, I think, I don't know. I see problems both ways. Like let me go with it one way first. If we're not critiquing Christianity, then who are we critiquing? Like, who's the bad guy here? What ideology? I guess it's the patriarchy in general. Like, the patriarchy is just going to get in control and repress women's sexuality. Is that the message? I guess there is that feminist argument, right? That kind of all men you get in power, they're going to do bad things to women. Yeah, maybe. And then to give credit where credit is due, the book does not portray all men as bad. But it's a patriarchy. And then in the book, it's not only the sexuality that's controlled, the women aren't even allowed to read. Like, a woman can get hung for reading. And I'm not quite sure where that element is coming from. I mean, obviously, again, I can see where she thinks that there's a certain element in society that wants to control women's sexuality. Because there is. Who wants to take away reading from women? I don't get it. And the other thing is, the patriarchy is not necessarily linked to this 1984 totalitarian stuff, right? Because I mean, like, we've had liberal bourgeois patriarchies. I mean, America in 1776, right? The original American Revolution, completely patriarchal. But there was none of this hanging women for reading or 1984 type stuff or totalitarian stuff. I mean, you could have a patriarchy, and you could even repress women's sexuality without these completely controlling governments. And for that matter, you could play vice versa. You could have a 1984 type government that completely didn't care at all about women's sexuality. Or, I don't know, maybe that's a debate. Actually, I'm beginning to think as I talk. The original 1984 by Orwell, he did actually make a point in that book that repressing sexuality was a big part of the regime because you had to get everything under your control. Okay, I don't know, it's a debate. But certainly, I mean, I think where this book goes a little bit wrong is there are valid dystopias. Like, totalitarian governments is something to be careful of. And in the author's introduction, she mentioned that she was writing this book when she was living in Western Germany, kind of West Berlin, kind of surrounded by the Soviet bloc. And she talks about the influence that had on her. So, okay, fair enough. There are totalitarian regimes. We know through history that women have been repressed sexually, controlled sexually. The marriage of the two, though, I don't know, maybe you should have just focused on one or the other, because the marriage of the two is where I'm kind of losing it a little bit. Like, what are we critiquing now? Are we critiquing the urge of the patriarchy to repress women, or women's sexuality, or who's trying to stop women from reading, or are we saying this is, I don't know. And then this gets tied in with the infertility crisis in The Handmaid's Tale. Sorry, The Handmaiden, the idea that these women are going to be given out to families that can't conceive. So now, I don't know, maybe they would be if there was this infertility crisis. But you see how we're piling too many things on at once. So, is this a warning against the future? Well, maybe if we've got an infertility crisis coming in. Otherwise, I mean, like, I just want to know what the point of all this was. And it was... I sound a little bit frustrated because the novel was a bit of a slog. It was slow moving. Like, there was a bit of a plot, but it was mostly kind of told kind of in backstory and moving slowly, and it was just so depressing, talking about kind of all the oppression, and you get the feeling that there's a point in this novel, but what's the point? Okay, I don't know. Let me digress here and talk about something else here. Now, I just said that Margaret Atwood said that this book is not a critique of Christianity. Maybe it should have been. I don't know, because at least if it was a critique of Christianity, there would be things in here to critique. Definitely Christianity is themed all the way through it. I don't know. You almost get the impression that it is a critique of Christianity. And she just got cold feet in one day and said, no, it's not a critique of Christianity. It would make more sense if it was a critique of Christianity, because then at least it would be something. There are parts in there. I grew up in a conservative Christian environment, and boy, I could tell you stories. I could tell so many stories. I could fill up this video telling with stories. There's a passage in this video when they're at some sort of a church service, and they're reciting the verse, and the verse is not cited here, but I know this well, having grown up in a conservative Christian environment. It's from 2 Timothy, where the author says, interesting little side note, the author of 2 Timothy is not Paul. All scholars of the New Testament believe that somebody was forging it in Paul's name. That's just by the by, a free little fact for you. They're saying, let the women learn in silence with all subjection. I suffer not a woman to teach nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was first formed, then Eve, and Eve was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in transgression. Nevertheless, she shall be saved by childbearing if they continue in faith and charity and wholeness with sobriety. That's all in the Bible, and in conservative circles, they latch onto those. I grew up in an environment where women were not allowed to have authority in the church because people were latching onto that verse. There is some debate, even in Christian circles, about whether that applies outside of the church. So, for example, you do have conservative women who believe that they can't have any authority in the church, but who go on to become politicians in certain political parties. On the other hand, I knew of denominations. I knew of this guy who was sent to a boarding school where they had a house mother and the house father. And the house mother was not allowed to make any decisions on her own without consulting the house father because, that was following the advice from Scripture in 2 Timothy. So you can imagine, if I'm a woman, I'm going to be concerned about this. I don't even care if these groups are out on the fringe. The fact that this belief is out there is kind of worrying me all the time about whether these people are going to get power. And that's where I think this would almost make more sense as a critique of Christianity, right-wing Christianity maybe. Except, again, that handmaiden thing is just coming out of nowhere. Okay, maybe if there's an infertility crisis. But it's not based on anything realistic at this point. Speaking of the handmaidens, that is also based on a thing in the Bible, the story of Rachel and Leah. And I remember this from my Bible school days. So Jacob is married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah, and they're having a competition to see who can have the most children. Because they feel like having more children will get them more favored in their husband's status, in their husband's eyes. And I remember I remember this from Bible school so clearly because we had so many questions about it as kids. They're unable to conceive as fast as they want, so they send their handmaidens to have sex with Jacob instead. And if Rachel's handmaiden gets pregnant with Jacob's child, that counts as Rachel's child. And now in Bible school, we had a chart we were making where we were writing down which sons of Jacob, because the sons of Jacob go on to become the tribes of Israel. So this is kind of like an important moment in biblical story. So we had this chart and we were writing down which children were produced from which. There was Rachel and Leah, and then there were their handmaidens. So we had to chart it all down. I couldn't tell you now whose child was whose, but we had it memorized